a 52-inch chest, the reigning Mr. Universe, the physical power to crush a human skull. Yet he was nothing but a helpless pawn in the most savage sexual coup d'etat in Hollywood history. It was a jealous brawl between Mae West and Jayne Mansfield, a weeping rivalry over a beautiful man. Romance was the alibi. Corporate assassination was the objective. What erupted in 1956 was a forbidden public relations war. Two female titans did not shed tears over a broken heart. They fought for territory. They fought for the absolute ruthless monopoly of the American sex symbol franchise. The strongest man alive was not a lover. He was a biological asset. He was a piece of fresh meat stolen in broad daylight, deployed to violently dismantle an aging empire and crown a new bloodthirsty matriarch. By the mid-1950s, Mae West operated as a sovereign entity. Having survived the patriarchal studio system of the 1930s by becoming her own industry, she countered censorship by taking her unapologetic brand of sexuality out of the film studios and onto the live stage, building a highly lucrative self-contained empire that stretched from Broadway to the booming, neon-lit desert of Las Vegas. West did not simply collect a paycheck. She negotiated a percentage of the box office and retained the copyright to her own dialogue. By owning the underlying intellectual property of her stage persona, she insulated herself from the fluctuating tastes of studio executives. Her financial independence allowed her to dictate the terms of her employment, transforming her from a contracted employee into an untouchable institution. She essentially franchised her own sexuality. Mae West understood that power in the entertainment industry was entirely transactional. She knew that the traditional Hollywood power structure required women to be passive objects of male desire. To maintain her dominance and to visually project her absolute authority, she inverted the system. She constructed a primal, shocking stage act that functioned as a matriarchal dictatorship. She surrounded herself with a court of glistening, hyper-muscled strong men. These men were weightlifters, bodybuilders, and acrobats. They were the physical peak of human conditioning. But on Mae West's stage, their physical strength did not equate to power. It equated to servitude. Mae West stripped these men of their autonomy. She dressed them in tiny loincloths. She oiled their skin. She commanded them to flex, to lift her, and to stand silently in the background while she delivered her dialogue. She deliberately castrated them of their agency to elevate her own. They were not her lovers. They were her visual accessories. They were props utilized to telegraph a specific corporate message. The Queen of Sex is so powerful that she treats the strongest men in the world as interchangeable decorative pets. It was the ultimate reversal of the Hollywood casting couch. Mae West was the executive, and the men were the depreciating biological capital. And the crown jewel of this massive flexing inventory was Mickey Hargitay. Mickey Hargitay was a Hungarian immigrant who had fled the Soviet occupation of Budapest. He possessed a staggering, perfectly symmetrical physique that had earned him the title of Mr. Universe in 1955. In the pages of fitness and health magazines, he was a god. He possessed the physical capacity to crush a man's skull with his bare hands. Yet in the gravitational pull of Mae West's empire, his biological strength was completely neutralized. Hargitay lacked the financial safety net and cultural fluency of native-born American actors. His survival in a foreign, highly competitive economy depended entirely on remaining agreeable to the industry gatekeepers. He could not afford the luxury of an artistic ego or a contractual rebellion. This socioeconomic vulnerability made him the perfect, compliant centerpiece for a matriarch demanding absolute submission. Mae West saw Hargitay's photograph on a magazine cover and immediately acquired him. She did not court him. She hired him. She installed him as the centerpiece of her Las Vegas Muscleman act. Mickey Hargitay was reduced from a champion athlete to a $500 a week prop. He was the ultimate living cup, a breathing trophy designed to prove that Mae West possessed the highest grade of male flesh available on the open market. Hargitay, a man of profound passivity despite his towering musculature, accepted this transaction. He understood his function. He was paid to look beautiful, to keep his mouth shut, and to make the queen look omnipotent. He was entirely objectified. He was the prize, but a prize is only valuable as long as the owner has the power to protect it. And Mae West, entrenched in the security of her Las Vegas throne, failed to recognize that the rules of Hollywood warfare were changing. The era of the slow, calculated boardroom execution was ending. The era of the tabloid terrorist was beginning. While Mae West was ruling her stage empire, the American mass media landscape was undergoing a violent mutation. The post-Korean War economic boom of the 1950s created a society hungry for constant, sensational, and visually shocking content. The old studio system was bleeding cash, losing its monopoly to the rising power of television and independent magazines. The industry needed a new type of product. It needed women who were not just actresses, but willing accomplices in their own mass market exploitation. It needed the Blonde Bombshell. Enter Jayne Mansfield. History has frequently miscategorized Jayne Mansfield as a tragic, dim-witted clone of Marilyn Monroe. This is a fatal misreading of the historical record. Marketed as a genius with a purported IQ of 163, Jayne Mansfield was actually a cold-blooded strategist who recognized exactly what the machine wanted, and she willingly fed herself into it on her own terms. Mansfield did not wait for a publicist to arrange her schedule. She directly memorized the phone numbers of the top syndicated photographers in Los Angeles and routinely tipped them off to her exact coordinates. If she attended a mundane grocery run, she ensured it became a highly choreographed photo opportunity. She functioned as her own aggressively efficient press agency, cutting out the middlemen to guarantee her face remained in the daily circulation. Jayne understood that in this new, hyper-accelerated media environment, actual theatrical talent was a secondary, almost irrelevant commodity. The only currency that mattered was visibility. Infamy was just as bankable as prestige, provided it dominated the front pages of the daily newspapers. She saw how 20th Century Fox was utilizing her. The studio executives had signed her to a contract for one specific corporate purpose: to use her as a tactical threat against Marilyn Monroe, who was currently striking for better pay and script approval. The studio wanted Marilyn to look at Jayne and realize she was replaceable. Monroe had recently fled to New York to study method acting, establishing her own production company to break Fox's unilateral control over her career. This act of corporate defiance terrified the studio board, threatening to set a dangerous precedent for other contracted talent. They desperately required a strikebreaker who possessed the exact same visual aesthetic but harbored zero interest in artistic autonomy. Mansfield fit the precise biological and psychological parameters of their problem. Jayne accepted this role, but she refused to be a passive pawn in a boardroom negotiation. She knew that relying on studio executives to build her career was a death sentence. To truly secure her position, she had to bypass the system entirely. She had to go directly to the press. She had to manufacture a scandal so loud, so audacious, and so visually spectacular that the studio would be forced to capitulate to her. She did not need a great script. She needed a stunt. She needed a victim. Jayne scanned the Hollywood landscape for a target. She needed an establishment figure whose humiliation would generate maximum international shockwaves. She needed a target that possessed something highly visible, highly valuable, and easily stolen. She locked her sights on Mae West. Targeting Mae West was a masterstroke of predatory public relations. Mae represented the old guard. She was the undisputed aging matriarch of sexual power. If Jayne could successfully breach Mae's defenses and humiliate her in public, she would not just make headlines. She would initiate a hostile takeover of the entire brand. It was the corporate equivalent of assassinating the king to claim the crown. But Jayne Mansfield could not simply insult Mae West in a newspaper interview. A verbal dispute could easily be dismissed by Mae's powerful publicity machine. To inflict maximum irreversible damage, the strike had to be physical. It had to be undeniable. And it had to occur on Mae West's own territory. Jayne needed to steal the crown jewel. She needed to hijack the Mr. Universe. Jayne calculated the logistics of the assault with clinical precision. She knew that Mae West's Muscleman Act was scheduled to debut in New York City at the legendary Latin Quarter nightclub in May 1956. This was the perfect theater for an execution. The Latin Quarter was not a closed Hollywood soundstage. It was a massive public arena packed with journalists, syndicated columnists, and thousands of paying spectators. It was ground zero for the East Coast media establishment. If Jayne executed the theft in private, it would be a rumor. If she executed it at the Latin Quarter, it would be a global news event. She did not care about Mickey Hargitay's intellect, his personality, or his emotional availability. She only cared about his corporate function. Hargitay was the physical manifestation of Mae West's pride. He was the anchor of the matriarch's illusion of control. By seducing Hargitay, Jayne would prove that the aging queen was powerless to hold on to her own property. Mansfield identified her target and chose the Latin Quarter as the ultimate public arena for her stunt. She flew to New York, heavily armed with provocative publicity tactics, ready to disrupt the Hollywood hierarchy in front of the East Coast media establishment. The Latin Quarter nightclub in New York City in May 1956 was not a venue for subtle theatrical art. It was a sprawling, multi-tiered cathedral of American excess, owned by impresario Lew Walters. It served as the absolute epicenter of East Coast media consumption. It was a room where syndicated gossip columnists, studio fixers, advertising executives, and high society predators gathered nightly to watch the machinery of fame operate in real time. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the clinking of expensive crystal, and the constant predatory flashing of camera bulbs. This specific geographic location was not chosen by accident. This was the exact highly visible theater Jayne Mansfield required to execute her corporate assassination. A private theft of a man in a hotel room would generate a rumor. A theft executed on the main floor of the Latin Quarter would be syndicated across 1,000 daily newspapers by breakfast. Mae West's stage production was an elaborate, highly choreographed assertion of total dominance. She was 62 years old, an age considered entirely obsolete in the biological mathematics of 1950s Hollywood. She defied this biological clock through sheer tyrannical willpower. She was wrapped in restrictive, heavily boned corsets and thick layers of theatrical makeup, functioning as the CEO of her own highly lucrative traveling corporation. Her entire act relied upon the absolute suspension of disbelief. The audience paying premium ticket prices had to accept the illusion that she, a sexagenarian matriarch, could command the absolute, unquestioning obedience of the most physically imposing men on the planet. The muscle men flanking her on stage were not actors. They were weightlifters, bodybuilders, and acrobats, hired strictly for their genetic and physical dimensions. They wore nothing but small, heavily sequined loincloths. They hoisted her onto their massive shoulders. They functioned as moving pedestals, living architecture designed to elevate the queen. Mae West deliberately castrated them of their agency to exponentially inflate her own. They were not permitted to speak. Speech would grant them humanity, and Mae West permitted no humanity on her stage, only compliance. They were visual accessories utilized to broadcast a highly specific corporate message. The reigning queen of sex is so powerful that she treats the strongest men in the world as interchangeable decorative pets. Mickey Hargitay was the apex of this human architecture. As the reigning 1955 Mr. Universe, he possessed a 52-inch chest, 19-inch biceps, and a perfectly symmetrical, heavily oiled physique that made him the gold standard of male biological capital. He was the most expensive prop in Mae West's inventory. His job was to stand in the harsh, hot pink spotlight and submit to her verbal commands. He was the ultimate living proof of her matriarchal dictatorship. He was the trophy that validated her brand. Jayne Mansfield did not arrive early to the Latin Quarter to politely watch a performance. Predators do not wait patiently in the audience. They arrive exactly when the cameras are primed, calibrated, and hungry for a disruption. She entered the venue flanked by her own press agents and a trailing swarm of aggressive photographers. Jayne was wearing a dress engineered to defy the laws of structural physics. It was a garment weaponized to maximize physical exposure while remaining barely technically compliant with the stringent indecency laws of 1956. The dress was a declaration of war against the heavier, older, and more restrictive costumes of the reigning queen on stage. It was a visual broadcast of youth, extreme fertility, and ruthless corporate ambition. Jayne secured a table directly in the primary sightline of the stage. She did not observe the show with the admiration of a fan. She watched the stage with the cold, dead-eyed calculation of a corporate raider inspecting a failing company's remaining assets. She waited for the precise moment when the lighting shifted, when the press corps had their lenses focused squarely on her table, and when Mae West took the stage flanked by her human trophies. Then, Jayne Mansfield initiated the execution. As Mickey Hargitay flexed his heavily oiled torso under the stage lights, projecting the illusion of Mae West's absolute, unbreakable control over her property, Jayne leaned toward her waiter. She did not whisper. She modulated her voice to ensure it carried over the ambient noise of the club, guaranteeing that the syndicated columnists sitting at the adjacent tables could record every syllable. "I'll have a steak," Jayne ordered, her gaze locking onto the stage and that tall man on the left. By equating the reigning Mr. Universe to a consumable item on a dinner menu, Mansfield shattered the heavily guarded illusion of Mae West's power. She proved to the press that West's most prized possession was easily swayed by a younger rival. She proved, in front of the most powerful media figures on the East Coast, that Mae West's most prized, carefully guarded possession was available for purchase by a younger, hungrier bidder. She demonstrated that the Queen could not control the loyalty of her own inventory. Jayne did not stop at the verbal assault. She immediately deployed her biological weaponry. When Hargitay, reacting to the sudden commotion and the blinding flash bulbs erupting near the front tables, looked down from the stage, Jayne locked eyes with him. She utilized the breathy, highly manufactured, hypersexualized persona that 20th Century Fox was paying her thousands of dollars to perfect. She visually hijacked the asset. Right in the middle of Mae West's carefully timed, highly expensive theatrical production, the prized asset stopped paying attention to the CEO. Mickey Hargitay looked away from Mae West and started looking directly at the hostile bidder. For Mae West, this was the ultimate unforgivable breach of corporate protocol. The illusion of her sexual omnipotence was instantly dissolved. The audience was no longer watching an untouchable queen command her loyal subjects. They were watching an aging woman lose control of her own property to a 23-year-old blonde upstart in real time. The power dynamic in the room inverted in a matter of seconds. The physical spotlight remained on the stage, tracking Mae West's movements, but the cultural oxygen was entirely, violently siphoned away by Jayne Mansfield. It was a flawless, highly visible public execution. The matriarch's throne was completely dismantled without a single physical altercation. Mae West did not weep. She did not confront Jayne Mansfield in a screaming match across the dining room floor. Mae West was a hardened creature of the old Hollywood studio system, a survivor of the 1930s censorship wars, and she responded with the only weapon she recognized: absolute corporate extermination. The moment the heavy velvet curtain fell, concluding the performance, the fury of the deposed queen was unleashed backstage. It was not the fury of a heartbroken lover who had been betrayed. It was the icy, sociopathic rage of a billionaire whose intellectual property has been stolen in broad daylight by a competitor. Mae West immediately summoned Mickey Hargitay to her dressing room. She did not demand an explanation. She did not ask for an apology. She fired him on the spot. She terminated his contract, ordered him to clear out of her theater, and instantly initiated a ruthless campaign to blacklist him from the lucrative East Coast stage circuit. She wanted to financially crush the muscle man. She needed to demonstrate to the rest of her remaining inventory, to the press corps waiting outside, and most importantly to Jayne Mansfield, that she still possessed the unilateral power to destroy the men she owned. She believed that by liquidating the compromised asset, she was reasserting her dominance and sealing the breach in her defenses. This was the exact, precise reaction Jayne Mansfield had engineered. Mae West, blinded by her bruised ego and relying on outdated methods of intimidation, failed to realize she had just walked directly into a meticulously laid public relations trap. By firing Mickey Hargitay, Mae West did not assert her power. She handed Jayne Mansfield the exact ammunition required to launch a billion-dollar media blitz. The paradigm of Hollywood warfare had shifted, and Mae West had missed the memo. If Mae had ignored the flirtation, if she had laughed it off and kept Hargitay on the payroll, Jayne's stunt would have been a minor one-day tabloid item. It would have been recorded as a night of bad manners by a desperate starlet. But by reacting with such aggressive, highly visible corporate violence, Mae West validated the threat. She proved to the world that Jayne Mansfield possessed the power to genuinely disrupt her empire. More crucially, Mae's retaliation transformed Mickey Hargitay from a silent, oiled stage prop into a highly publicized, incredibly valuable victim. He was now the unemployed, discarded boy toy who had lost his entire livelihood simply because he looked at the wrong woman. Jayne Mansfield immediately swooped in to claim the wreckage. She did not claim Mickey out of pity, charity, or sudden romantic infatuation. She claimed him because a discarded Mr. Universe, freshly fired by the legendary Mae West, was the most valuable piece of PR currency currently circulating in the United States. He was the ultimate prop for her own ascending narrative. Jayne possessed the story. She was the young, irresistible force of nature who had shattered an aging matriarch's empire with a single glance and a joke about a steak. She was the glamorous savior of the wrongly terminated strongman. She had successfully hijacked the brand, stolen the inventory, and utilized the old queen's own temper to finalize the transaction. The bloodless coup at the Latin Quarter was complete, but the psychological exploitation of the stolen prize was only just beginning. The moment Mae West fired Mickey Hargitay, she did not erase a rebellious employee. She manufactured a highly explosive public relations weapon and handed the detonator directly to her enemy. Jayne Mansfield did not offer the discarded strongman a shoulder to cry on. She offered him a press conference. Jayne understood the absolute, unyielding law of the 1950s tabloid economy. The media did not care about the artistic integrity of a nightclub performance. The media cared about the blood sport of female rivalry. By immediately claiming the exact biological asset that Mae West had just publicly liquidated, Jayne transformed a localized nightclub dispute into a syndicated national corporate war. She absorbed Mickey Hargitay into her own violently expanding publicity machine. She did not hide him. She paraded him. He was no longer a person. He was a seized corporate asset. Jayne dragged him to premieres, restaurants, and highly populated Los Angeles intersections, ensuring that a phalanx of photographers documented their every movement. He was undeniable photographic proof that the old Hollywood matriarchy was dead, and the new, ruthlessly efficient blonde regime had taken power. This media blitz was not an accident of sudden passion. It was a calculated demonstration of force aimed directly at the executive boardrooms of 20th Century Fox. During this exact time frame, Fox executives were engaged in a bitter standoff with their most valuable star. The studio system was fracturing, and the demand for script approval and greater artistic control terrified the management. They viewed this insubordination not as a standard negotiation, but as an existential threat to their absolute authority. To crush this leverage, they required an immediate, highly visible substitute. They sought a biological copy who projected the identical aesthetic appeal, but functioned strictly as a compliant, unquestioning employee. Jayne Mansfield positioned herself as the perfect, fully compliant synthetic alternative, and the theft of Mickey Hargitay was her ultimate audition tape. By stealing Mae West's prized possession and dominating every magazine cover in America without spending a single dollar of the studio's marketing budget, Jayne proved her corporate utility. She demonstrated to 20th Century Fox that she was a self-sustaining publicity generator. She did not need a prestige script to make headlines. She only needed a victim and a camera. The studio rewarded her ruthlessness. They handed her starring roles, utilizing the massive wave of free, scandal-driven publicity to sell tickets to films like The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? Jayne Mansfield used the bleeding, discarded ego of Mae West as a stepping stone to secure a multi-million-dollar studio contract. The psychosexual coup d'etat was a complete financial success. But the most deeply cynical, profoundly disturbing aspect of this transaction was the subsequent fate of the stolen prize. Mickey Hargitay, the 1955 Mr. Universe, possessed the physical capacity to crush a cinder block. He was the apex of male biological conditioning. Yet, in the brutal hierarchy of Hollywood's sexual economics, his extreme masculinity was completely weaponized against him. He was traded from one female dictatorship to another, and while Mae West had utilized him as a silent, decorative stage prop, Jayne Mansfield subjected him to a far more insidious form of psychological castration. In 1958, Jayne Mansfield and Mickey Hargitay were married. The press presented it as the ultimate union of physical perfection, the Blonde Bombshell and the Mr. Universe. In reality, the marriage was a hostile acquisition. Jayne did not marry a partner. She acquired a highly functional, unpaid domestic servant who happened to possess a 52-inch chest. Jayne immediately moved to strip Hargitay of his independent identity. She purchased a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion on Sunset Boulevard and painted it entirely pink. It was christened the Pink Palace. It was a monument to her own manufactured brand. And who built the monuments inside this palace? The Mr. Universe. Hargitay, who had worked as a plumber and carpenter before his bodybuilding career, was put to work. He physically constructed the mansion's infamous pink, heart-shaped swimming pool. He installed the pink shag carpeting that ran up the walls and across the ceilings. Hargitay essentially built the pink confines of his own domestic subordination. Jayne took the photographs posed by the pool and absorbed all the cultural credit. The public emasculation escalated from manual labor to visual degradation. Jayne Mansfield understood that her brand relied on the absolute, undeniable hypersexualization of her own body. To maximize the visual impact of her curves, she needed a contrast. She needed a backdrop. She utilized her husband. She forced Hargitay to accompany her to press junkets and photo shoots wearing ridiculously small leopard print swimsuits or tight, emasculating short shorts. He was ordered to hold her excessive collection of chihuahuas. He was photographed wearing a domestic apron, holding their infants while Jayne posed in the foreground in diamonds and mink. This was not a progressive feminist inversion of gender roles. This was the raw, unadulterated objectification of a human being for commercial profit. Jayne Mansfield deliberately reduced the strongest man in the world to a laughable, subservient accessory. She turned him into a handbag with biceps. Mickey Hargitay was forced to smile through the humiliation. He was trapped in the gravity of her fame. If he complained, if he attempted to assert his own authority, he risked being discarded exactly as Mae West had discarded him. He was a man who had won the ultimate genetic lottery, only to discover that in a capitalist media ecosystem, extreme physical beauty makes you a target for extreme exploitation. He was completely objectified, commodified, and stripped for parts. She had consumed his independence entirely, transforming the world's strongest man into her most photographed, emasculated accessory. This hyper-manufactured, grotesquely transactional display of sexuality did not just dominate the American domestic market, it became a highly aggressive cultural export. Halfway across the globe in the conservative, traumatized landscape of post-Korean War South Korea, magazines featuring Mansfield and her domesticated Mr. Universe arrived in the duffel bags and footlockers of the American military presence. The cultural collision was instantaneous and violent. For a traditional Korean citizen in 1956, encountering a photograph of Jayne Mansfield, a woman unapologetically weaponizing her own sexuality, dripping in diamonds, leading a domesticated, half-naked Mr. Universe around on a metaphorical leash, was not just shocking. It was an ideological earthquake. This was not simply pornography. It was a visual manifesto of a terrifyingly alien civilization. The imagery of Jayne Mansfield broadcast a message of inconceivable material wealth and a horrifying, chaotic level of personal freedom. It demonstrated a society where traditional moral codes had been completely eradicated by capitalism. It showed a world where a woman could publicly seize a man, turn sex into an industrial assembly line, and be rewarded with a mansion. To the conservative elements of post-war Korean society, the Blonde Bombshell was a symbol of Western moral decay, an invading force more insidious than a physical army because it attacked the psychological foundation of the culture. But to others, particularly the younger generation standing in the rubble of their destroyed cities, that same imagery represented an intoxicating, highly dangerous promise of individualism. Jayne Mansfield inadvertently became the bizarre flesh and blood avatar of the American dream, a grotesque, fascinating proof that in the West, you possess the right to turn yourself into a product and sell yourself to the highest bidder. The battle for a muscle man at the Latin Quarter had rippled outward, mutating into a global projection of American corporate power. Jayne Mansfield had successfully utilized the press to crush Mae West, secure a studio monopoly, and export her brand of weaponized sexuality across the Pacific Ocean. She had won the war, she possessed the house, the studio contract, and the domesticated strongman. But a kingdom built entirely on the unstable foundation of tabloid shock value is a kingdom built on a fault line. The media machine is a cannibalistic entity. It demands constant, escalating sacrifices to sustain its attention. Jayne Mansfield had fed the machine the dignity of Mae West and the masculinity of Mickey Hargitay. But soon the machine would run out of external victims. It would turn its massive grinding gears toward the architect of the scandal herself. The predator, who had masterminded the most ruthless psychosexual coup of the 1950s, was about to discover the fatal, unavoidable flaw in her own corporate strategy. When your entire existence is defined by the flash of a camera bulb, You do not get to decide when the lights turn off. And the final brutal invoice for her sudden explosive rise to power was about to be collected. The machinery of public relations is not a passive mirror reflecting reality. It is an active predatory organism. It demands a constant escalating supply of human fuel to maintain its velocity. But in the ruthless mathematics of Hollywood, an asset whose entire valuation is based on shock value is inherently unstable. Shock, by definition, has a rapidly depreciating half-life. Mae West understood this. She was a veteran of the long game. The humiliation she suffered at the Latin Quarter was absolute, a visceral wound inflicted in front of the East Coast media establishment. But Mae West was not a fragile starlet. She was a deeply entrenched, financially independent institution. She retreated to her Los Angeles penthouse, a fortress insulated by millions of dollars in real estate and investments. She did not engage in a public war of words with Jayne Mansfield. She executed a far more chilling retaliation: total, permanent erasure. In the court of Mae West, the name Jayne Mansfield was officially eradicated. To speak the name of the blonde usurper in Mae's presence was grounds for immediate termination. Mae West categorized her rival with the most degrading lower-class terminology available, refusing to acknowledge her as a peer. This was not merely the sulking of a defeated woman. It was a calculated psychological defense mechanism. Mae West's entire empire was constructed upon the illusion of her absolute, unbreakable supremacy over the male sex and her peers. The theft of Mickey Hargitay was a physical breach of that illusion. To acknowledge Jayne Mansfield's existence was to acknowledge that the breach had occurred. Therefore, Mae West simply altered her own reality. She walled herself off, replacing Hargitay with a rotating cast of younger, cheaper, and more compliant musclemen. She preserved herself in amber, an aging queen refusing to look out the window at the changing world, clutching her remaining wealth and her fractured pride. But while Mae West chose the paralysis of isolation, Jayne Mansfield was forced to keep dancing for the cameras. And the cameras were growing bored. The executive board at 20th Century Fox had utilized Jayne Mansfield with surgical precision. They needed a weapon to break the leverage of Marilyn Monroe. Jayne was the perfect compliant strikebreaker. She possessed the exact biological dimensions required, and she lacked the artistic neuroses that made Monroe a management nightmare. But a weapon is only valuable as long as the war is active. Once the studio had managed Monroe, Jayne Mansfield's primary corporate function evaporated. The studio executives looked at their balance sheets. They realized they had manufactured a clone that was now demanding the salary and the promotional budget of a premium asset. Fox immediately began to liquidate her value. They stopped assigning her to A-list directors. They stripped her of top-tier scripts. They rented her out to cheap, independent European productions to recoup their initial investment. They explicitly instructed the wardrobe and makeup departments to exaggerate her features to the point of grotesque caricature. The wardrobe department was instructed to supply garments that bordered on parody, intentionally undermining her physical appeal. She was cast in low-budget farces where her signature breathy voice and exaggerated curves were utilized strictly for cheap comedic relief rather than genuine allure. Fox was actively depreciating her visual brand, ensuring she could never leverage her fame to negotiate a better contract at a rival studio. They systematically dismantled the machine they had built. Jayne Mansfield was no longer a threat. She was a punchline. The studio deliberately transformed the Blonde Bombshell into a walking cartoon, a cheap parody of the very sexuality she had weaponized against Mae West. Jayne recognized the shift in the corporate wind. She felt the ground crumbling beneath her stiletto heels. But unlike Joan Crawford, who survived the studio collapse by mutating into a hardened, serious actress, Jayne possessed no alternate strategy. Her entire identity, her entire financial portfolio was tied to her physical exposure. When the premium studios closed their doors, she did not retreat. She doubled down on the exact same tactics she had used at the Latin Quarter. She accelerated the spectacle. If the A-list premieres would not invite her, she crashed them. If the respectable magazines would not put her on the cover, she orchestrated highly visible, meticulously planned wardrobe malfunctions in front of the paparazzi. She weaponized her own children, dragging them into the flashbulbs, utilizing them as props to generate sympathy or outrage. She understood that in the absence of prestige, notoriety is the only currency that prevents bankruptcy. The Pink Palace on Sunset Boulevard, the ultimate symbol of her triumph over the Hollywood hierarchy, mutated into a financial sinkhole. Maintaining the illusion of extreme wealth required an enormous, constant influx of cash. To pay the mortgage on the monuments she had built, Jayne was forced to accept increasingly degrading employment. The woman who had commanded the attention of the global press corps was reduced to performing in cheap regional nightclubs, singing off-key and engaging in vulgar banter with drunken audiences. She was selling the decaying remnants of her brand to the lowest bidder. And inside the walls of that Pink Palace, the stolen trophy was finally cracking. Mickey Hargitay, the 1955 Mr. Universe, had endured years of public emasculation. He had been paraded in leopard print swimsuits. He had been utilized as a domestic servant, a prop designed to highlight the curves of his wife. He had been the physical proof of Jayne's victory over Mae West. But a human being, even a champion bodybuilder, can only be treated as an accessory for so long before the psychological damage becomes irreversible. Hargitay recognized that he was entirely trapped in a manufactured reality. He was not a husband. He was an employee in the Jayne Mansfield Corporation. When the corporate profits began to dry up, the utility of the marriage dissolved. The domestic environment became a war zone of financial panic and desperate PR stunts. The ultimate symbol of physical strength filed for divorce, successfully extracting himself from the Pink Palace and leaving the queen of publicity to face the collapsing empire alone. The loss of Hargitay was a devastating blow to Jayne's carefully curated image. She had built her mythology on the premise that she possessed the power to seize and domesticate the ultimate male specimen. Without the muscle man standing behind her, the illusion of her matriarchal dominance fractured. She attempted to replace him with a string of lawyers, directors, and managers, but none possessed the visual impact of the stolen Mr. Universe. The narrative of the invincible Blonde Bombshell was failing. As the 1950s bled into the 1960s, the entire cultural landscape of America underwent a violent seismic shift. The hyper-manufactured, polished, and strictly controlled studio glamour that had defined both Mae West and Jayne Mansfield became entirely obsolete. The public no longer wanted the polished illusion. They wanted the gritty, raw realism of the counterculture. The industry moved toward independent filmmakers, political cinema, and a new breed of actresses who rejected the rigid, aesthetic demands of the studio system. Jayne Mansfield found herself stranded in an era that actively despised her aesthetic. She was a relic of a bygone PR war, a physical manifestation of the exact kind of corporate, artificial sexuality the new generation was protesting. The desperation became palpable. It became frantic. Jayne engaged in increasingly bizarre and dangerous affiliations to generate headlines. She allied herself with Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, inviting the press to document her involvement in staged occult rituals. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The public was not shocked. They were repulsed. The stunt did not generate box office revenue. It generated disgust. The major studios permanently severed all ties. She was branded toxic, a liability that no legitimate producer would touch. The predator, who had executed the most brilliant bloodless coup in the history of the Latin Quarter, was now completely isolated. She had utilized the media machine to destroy Mae West's pride, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the machine itself. The media does not work for the asset. It feeds on the asset. Jayne Mansfield had offered herself to the cameras, and the cameras had methodically, efficiently consumed her. Mae West, sitting in her Los Angeles penthouse, watched the destruction of her rival from a safe, heavily guarded distance. She did not express pity. She did not issue a statement of reconciliation. She allowed the silence to act as her final, brutal verdict. Mae West had lost a muscle man, but she had retained her capital. She survived by refusing to play the game when the rules changed. Jayne Mansfield died playing the game because she knew no other way to exist. The final fatal invoice for the stolen spotlight was being prepared. The machinery of Hollywood was done extracting value from the synthetic asset. The studio had moved on. The husband had fled. The public had turned their backs. The only thing left for Jayne Mansfield was the relentless, driving need to find the next camera, the next audience, the next desperate stunt to prove that she was still alive. And it was this exact unyielding desperation that would drive her onto a dark, narrow highway in Louisiana, hurtling toward a violent, mechanical conclusion that would permanently seal the legacy of the Hollywood media wars in blood and shattered glass. The brutal mathematical reality of fame, built entirely on public relations, is that it possesses no safety net. When an actress builds her career on the foundation of a prestige studio contract, she can occasionally survive a string of box office failures by retreating into character roles or theater. But when a woman constructs her entire corporate identity on the weaponization of her own flesh, on the deliberate, highly publicized theft of a rival's biological asset, she cannot retreat. She has no secondary skills to leverage. She must keep feeding the media machine, or the machine will feed on her. By the summer of 1967, the Jayne Mansfield Corporation was bankrupt. The major Hollywood studios, having successfully utilized her to break the negotiating power of their premium blonde assets, had entirely liquidated her contract. The elite directors refused to return her calls. The Los Angeles Press Corps, which had once documented her every heavily engineered wardrobe malfunction, had moved on to a younger, cheaper generation of starlets. The Pink Palace on Sunset Boulevard, the sprawling synthetic monument to her triumph over Mae West and the Hollywood hierarchy, had mutated into a massive Financial liability. The mortgage required a constant, aggressive influx of cash, and the premium revenue streams had evaporated. To maintain the illusion of extreme wealth, Jayne Mansfield was forced into the lowest, most physically degrading tier of the American entertainment ecosystem. She was reduced to the regional nightclub circuit. This was not the Latin Quarter in New York City. This was not the epicenter of the East Coast media establishment, where she had once executed a flawless, bloodless coup d'etat against the reigning queen of sex. This was the Gus Stevens Supper Club in Biloxi, Mississippi. The specific geography of her financial desperation established the exact conditions for the catastrophic conclusion of her relentless PR war. Jayne Mansfield was 34 years old, a mother of 5, performing a grueling, humiliating cabaret act in the deep, sweltering humidity of the American South. She was singing off-key, delivering heavily scripted double entendre jokes to audiences of regional businessmen and tourists. She was actively selling the decaying, tragic remnants of the Blonde Bombshell brand at discount prices. She had utilized Mickey Hargitay, the stolen Mr. Universe, to climb to the apex of the tabloids, but the physical reality of the climb had exhausted her capital. Hargitay was gone, divorced, and discarded when his utility expired. In his place, Jayne was flanked by Sam Brody, a lawyer who functioned as her manager and latest abrasive, volatile companion. She was no longer the apex predator. She was a fading asset, frantically swimming to stay ahead of the creditors. The desperation for visibility dictated her every movement. In the early hours of June 29, 1967, after completing 2 exhaustive performances at the Biloxi Supper Club, Jayne did not rest. Rest is a luxury for those who possess secure contracts. Jayne had secured an early morning television interview in New Orleans, Louisiana. In the ruthless economy of a fading star, a local television appearance was an opportunity to generate free publicity to prove to the remaining booking agents that she still possessed cultural relevance. She had to be on camera. The brand demanded it. She loaded her 3 youngest children into the back seat of a 1966 Buick Electra. Sam Brody sat in the passenger seat. Ronnie Harrison, a 20-year-old local driver hired by the club, took the wheel. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning. They embarked on the dark, treacherous stretch of U.S. Highway 90, cutting through the dense mosquito-infested swamplands of Louisiana. This was the grim, unglamorous reality behind the blonde ambition. The woman who had proudly hijacked the global press, who had forced 20th Century Fox to rewrite their ledgers, was now hurtling down a pitch-black 2-lane highway in the middle of the night, driven by a college student desperately chasing a local morning talk show segment just to keep her name in print. The crash was not a Hollywood tragedy. It was the brutal, mechanical result of high-speed colliding with thick pesticide fog. Ahead of the Buick on Highway 90, a heavy tractor trailer had slowed down. A truck pumping thick white pesticide fog to combat the severe mosquito population was crawling along the road, enveloping the highway in an impenetrable opaque cloud. The driver of the Buick, traveling at a high rate of speed, plunged directly into the pesticide fog. He never saw the tractor trailer. He never had the opportunity to hit the brakes. The collision was a catastrophic event of sheer kinetic violence. The Buick slammed into the rear of the semi-truck. Because the trailer sat high off the ground, the impact did not stop the car at its bumper. The heavy steel of the trailer sheared off the entire roof of the Buick Electra. It was a complete mechanical decapitation of the vehicle. The three adults in the front seat, Ronnie Harrison, Sam Brody, and Jayne Mansfield, were killed instantly by massive blunt force trauma to the skull. The three children sleeping in the rear seat survived with minor injuries, shielded by the lowered trajectory of the crushed roof. The architect of Hollywood's most audacious publicity stunt was ultimately silenced by the blind, indifferent physics of a highway collision. The tragedy of Jayne Mansfield did not end with her death. The press quickly monetized the crash. When photos of a blonde wig in the wreckage surfaced, tabloids fabricated a sensational rumor that Mansfield had been decapitated, completely ignoring the coroner's report of a fatal skull injury. The media machine consumed her final moments strictly for profit. Meanwhile, Mae West remained secure in her Los Angeles penthouse. She possessed millions in real estate and total control over her brand. When news of Mansfield's death broke, West maintained absolute silence. She refused to issue a public statement, knowing that mourning her rival would permanently validate the woman who had stolen her spotlight a decade earlier. This contrast highlights the economics of Hollywood power. Mae West survived because she operated as a self-contained monopoly, owning her assets and dictating her own terms. Jayne Mansfield built her empire on the unstable currency of public attention. Mansfield won the initial PR battle, but West won the long game. She outlived her rival by 13 years, passing away in 1980 with her wealth and image entirely intact. Ironically, Mickey Hargitay, the man treated as a pawn in this rivalry, was the one who successfully escaped the machine. He retreated from Hollywood, became a successful real estate investor, and lived quietly until his death in 2006. While the 1950s established the blueprint for scandal-driven celebrity, these tactics began much earlier. In the silent era of the 1920s, a calculating European rival orchestrated the theft of the reigning studio queen's husband directly on a movie set. Next time, we explore Gloria Swanson versus Pola Negri. This was a war of high society ideologies, where a French count's title was the prize. We will examine the mechanics of high-level husband theft in the Golden Age. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to join us for the next chapter.